Well, hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Culture of Generosity. I'm Roy Harriman with Ministry Pacific, and we will be joined in just a moment by Scott Harris, who is Vice President of Church and Global Engagement with Mission Increase. Today's show is a free service of Ministry Pacific, and we provide webinars and numerous other free resources for our clients because we really want you to succeed. Ministry Pacific is an insurance broker, and we're exclusively committed to serving churches and nonprofits. We're not an insurance company. Sometimes there's some confusion there. Insurance agents work for insurers, but insurance brokers work for you. We work for the customer. And as a broker, we're free to research the market and find the best coverage for you. So we are here to serve, and please take us up on our offer of a free consultation at ministrypacific.com. Now to introduce our guest, Scott Harris is Vice President of Church and Global Engagement with Mission Increase, an organization that coaches and consults with faith-based nonprofits to help them flourish, and all at no charge. His role is to help nonprofits and churches partner more effectively for ministry. Scott was born in San Jose, grew up as a missionary kid in the Caribbean, and then lived in the UK and Hong Kong as a minister and church planter. For 18 years, he served as missions pastor at Brentwood Baptist Church in Brentwood, Tennessee, where he now lives. Welcome, Scott.
Roy, great to be with you and everyone on the call.
Excellent. Well, Scott, I just gave a thumbnail explanation of the work of Mission Increase. Can you expand on that for us so we have a better understanding of what you do?
Sure, Roy. Well, for those of you that are either a church leader or a nonprofit leader, you know, any community in America has churches and has faith-based nonprofits, right? And so Mission Increase, we exist to equip the faith-based nonprofit in organizational health. We lead with biblical fundraising because funding is the number one topic of interest for faith-based nonprofits. And we figure that if we can deliver good biblical training on that topic, we can then introduce other topics that they also need, such as governance and strategic planning, etc. And so we currently have over 3,000 faith-based nonprofits that have coaching accounts with us, and we're in about 26 communities in the country with an expanding footprint overseas as well. So that's a thumbnail on Mission Increase and what we do.
So what makes it possible for at least some of your services to be free to your church and
Yes,
nonprofit partners?
right. Good question, Roy. So we started in Portland, Oregon, a godly, generous Christian couple. They would always tell the story that every December 31st, they would write a check to their local rescue mission with their fingers crossed, praying that it would stay open one more year, right?
Wow.
Here's a ministry that has a big heart, there's a big need, but they just didn't have all the tools in the toolbox. So this couple said, what if instead of just giving money, what if we invested our funding in developing content and a coaching system that could equip the nonprofit year over year in organizational health and increased revenue? And so they did that. And their original focus was 5 West Coast cities. Well, then when other cities heard about this and said, please come to our town, come to Orlando, come to Fort Worth, said, you know, we don't have enough to put a full-time coach in every city in America. So they went to a local funding model. So when donors, including churches in a given city, want to knit resources together to provide coaching and training for faith-based nonprofits. So it's a locally funded position. And so we have these 26 coaches in these 26 cities that provide all of their coaching services to the faith-based nonprofit at no charge.
Now, if you're not in a city with a coach, can you still connect with Mission Increase?
Yes, yes, Roy, you can. So we have what's called the national community. And I don't know if anyone on the call is from Fargo, North Dakota, but we always use Fargo as an example. What if a group of nonprofits that Mission Increase, for whatever reason, never gets to Fargo, or it's going to take us years to get to Fargo? How can we connect with ministries in Fargo? So, especially, you know, in light of COVID and people going virtual, we have a way of doing that. So, whether you're a nonprofit leader on this call or know of one, or you're a church leader on this call and know of others, as you interact with faith-based nonprofits, send them our way. We exist to seek and serve them, and we are growing in how we also partner with, service, equip churches in their financial realities as well. So we serve both churches and nonprofits.
Well, that's a remarkable story of a vision as opposed to just simply the founders investing in a mission to keep it afloat. Not
Yes,
only doing that, but providing the tools to support the infrastructure to make it healthy going forward.
that's right. And Roy, I'll just say on that point, what's fascinating, and I am a pastor, I have a church congregation mindset, right? And what I find fascinating when it comes to the faith-based nonprofit world, there are very few resources specifically for the faith-based nonprofit. There are a lot of tools and resources for the congregational leader, right? How to have a better men's ministry, children's ministry. What kind of insurance do we need? There are all of these wonderful resources to help pastors and churches figure out their way forward. But there's very little for the faith-based nonprofit. And so that's why, as a pastor, I was looking for who is out there that can help equip our faith-based nonprofit partners to do better work. Luckily, I found Mission Increase. I now work for them, but I was surprised how little there is out there specifically for the faith-based nonprofit.
It seems like there is I don't want to say an abundance, but it seems like there are ample consultants for singular campaigns. Like we're going to expand the children's wing and we need 12 million bucks. Who can help with your one-off things like that. But as far as someone who helps to have a 52-week mindset of
Yes.
stewardship and generosity, I haven't met anyone until you.
Well, and it's fascinating, Roy, that this whole topic of generosity is not one that is more embraced by Christian leaders, whether they're in the congregation space or in the nonprofit space. Because, as I read my Bible, I mean, God has a lot to say about giving and generosity. So the idea that giving is good for us, right? So as a pastor, I always thought it was an incredible opportunity and a very exciting thing to give a message of generosity to our people. Of course, there are better ways to do it than others, right? But God's people are meant to be generous. So we're not so much asking people to give, is we're helping people to give. And those are not always the same things. And so, learning how to think about generosity as a Christian leader, what is your theology of generosity? Why is it good for you? Are you living a generous life? And then, how do we impart that vision to our people? Not just because we need their money, but they're made to give. And so it's good for us. And having healthy conversations and building cultures of generosity, everybody wins.
The idea that we're struggling with our financial situation or that we wish people were more generous, it seems like it is a universal trend, at least in Western cultures. A survey by Vanco, which is a financial processing company for
Mm,
nonprofits, it found that only 5% of churchgoers give 10% or more of their income
mhm.
to their church, 5%. And then the average giver donates $884 a year. And 50% of those who give about 2% of their income to their church. Nearly 40% of churchgoers give nothing. And I can say, based on my experience, these numbers seem to be relevant and correct. Scott, what do you think is behind these numbers? I mean, I'm sure that some of it can be attributed to just human nature, where in our natural state we want to look out for number one, but I doubt that's all that's there.
Great question, Roy. So there are probably multiple factors, but here is one idea, one concept that I think is worth sort of parking on. And Roy, Gene's asking to repeat those numbers because they were
Hmm.
so compelling. Let me just pitch an idea that, for some strange reason, is sort of countercultural. I would say generosity begets generosity. Okay, I don't think anyone would argue with that. But I think here is what church leaders often miss. When church leaders talk about generosity, typically what they mean is, how do we inspire and equip our members to give additional resources to the church? Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But here's where we cut that process short. The best way for a church to inspire their members to be more generous to the church is if the church itself is generous to the community and to the world. Now, that doesn't mean it's still easy, but I think that most pastors and most church leaders see the congregation as the recipient of God's people's generosity instead of a conduit of God's people's generosity. So I've done a little research on where are the radically generous churches in North America. Okay, now, how would you define radically generous? For the purposes of my little research project, where are the churches that give away half of their money? Now, I'm not saying that that's the gold standard. I'm not saying that every church is supposed to do that. But where are the churches that give at least half? And what is their experience in investing so many funds to the greater kingdom? I started to get a taste of this when I was a pastor in Hong Kong, Roy. And, in Hong Kong, we didn't have a church building. We did not aspire to have a church building. And I'm not against church buildings. But in the last year that I was a pastor there, we gave 43% of our church income away. And I just thought that's what you did. And I was reminded when I moved back to the States that not only do God's people need to become more generous, congregations need to become more generous. And so, this little research project that I've done, where are the radically generous churches in North America? They're all different. They all do generosity in different ways. But here's what they will all say: they are growing because they're generous. There are people who want to be a part of their church because the church models generosity. There's a church in Alabama. Their goal is to meet their annual budget by September 30th every year. And so everything in fourth quarter goes out the door. So the whole church gets behind it. And last year, they all raced to beat that September 30th deadline. And guess what? By September 1st, they had their annual budget met. And they will tell you, people join their church and people give more of their money to the church when the church is seen as being radically generous. And again, not that 50% is the ideal. So, as part of your generosity strategy as a church leader, not only how you grow the generosity of your members, but what about the generosity of your church? Do you give 5%? What's a 2-year plan to get to 10%? Do you give 10%? What's a 2-year plan to get to 15, 16, 17%? You give 20%? What's a plan to get to 30%? I mean, if it's true that you can't outgive God, if that's true for an individual, I think it's also true for a congregation. So I wonder, are these numbers so low in part because God's people do not see generosity modeled by their congregation? So again, that's not a silver bullet, doesn't solve all the issues, but I do think it is something that church leaders really need to wrestle with. How are we modeling generosity as a congregation?
Yeah, you can definitely see how people get excited about doing good in their community, particularly if they can, see it or touch it in some way. If they're a volunteer, it becomes up close as opposed to the report from some country that you can't pronounce and you don't even know where
Right.
it is on the map. What are some, you mentioned churches giving away 30, 40, 50%. What are some of the destinations, for example, what are some of the community or
Yes.
world causes that they support? Because I know one thing that seems like it's common, churches support some international work, which they should, but locally there's nothing.
So I was a missions pastor for 18 years, and I always said that I knew I was doing my job when I offended everybody. Okay, so here's what would happen. Half the people would say, "Hey, why are we sending so much money around the world when there's so much need right here in our own community?" And the other half of the people would say, "Hey, why are we spending so much just on our own community when there's so much need all around the world?" So I kind of knew that I was doing something right if both were saying it's not enough. And I would just simply say that it's both and, to your point, Roy, um, because that's what the Bible tells us, right? The Bible tells us that we are to have a heart for our community and we're to have a heart for the world. And there's no magic formula for what it's supposed to be, but that's for every church, every community of faith to wrestle with. And maybe that number changes over time, given how the Lord leads, given opportunity, given need, but it has to be an ongoing conversation. But I would always say, both better be there, right? And you also must sort of mix your giving. You want to be part of the harvest. So, where is God really moving locally and around the world? And let's help bring in that harvest. But also, we're supposed to sow seed where the harvest is not yet. So, what are the areas both locally and around the world where we can sow seed to prepare the soil for the harvest? So, again, it's both and on multiple levels. And so you find that certain churches have priorities based on affinity and calling, whether it's Bible translation or food insecurity or church planting. I mean, there are no shortage of needs, right? And there is no shortage of ways to impact those needs. Now, as a church, we were always wrestling with, we always wanted to give enough to a ministry where they would call us back. But we never wanted to give so much that their existence depended on our giving. So trying to find that sweet spot, that's a good guiding principle of we wanted to be significant to make a difference, but also not so significant that they would shut their doors if something happened right to our giving. So those are just that's just a general principle to sort of keep in mind. Also, where are your people already working and serving? As a pastor, I did not see when our church members were volunteering at various ministries and nonprofits. I did not see that as competition. I did not see that as a loss. If it's true that our churches, our congregations are supposed to be equipping centers, right? Ephesians 4. We're called to, as leaders, to equip our people for acts of ministry, both within the four walls of the church, but also outside. So the deeper relationships I could have with nonprofits in our community, where we could invest not only our dollars, but our people, that was just a win-win for everyone.
What are some examples that are notable or stand out to you, Scott, of local types of organizations that churches have invested in and partnered with?
Yes. Well, you know, it runs the gamut from a crisis pregnancy center to a food bank to a literacy program. Any and every community would have multiple faith based nonprofits. Also, I would say I've known some very faithful congregations that invest in non faith based nonprofits. Again, It depends on the circumstances, the need. Um, yes, you may sometimes have to wrestle with theological implications, but most congregations, of course, would partner with faith-based nonprofits, right? Where your worldview and your view on the Bible align somewhat. But I think a case can be made sometimes for supporting non-faith-based nonprofits. Again, you just need a culture that prioritizes generosity. And when you do, you're going to lean in and you're going to find the margin and time to wrestle with finding those good partners. And I would say nonprofits and churches sometimes don't have the best relationship. Now, sometimes they have good relationships. Those are almost accidental. And when they do have a good relationship, I often find they could be so much deeper. But historically, churches and nonprofits sometimes find themselves at odds with each other. And that is not God's design. I would say that they are both expressions of God's big C church. The church gathered, the congregation, the church sent, the church scattered on mission, the faith based nonprofit. We see this in the Bible. You have the synagogue, and you had many, quote, associations of Jews who would get together, the Nazarites, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. So you have two expressions of the Jewish people in the synagogue expression, but also in this guild expression. You see this in Catholic tradition. You have the parish and you have the orders, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, right? The gathered congregation, but also the task force, the group of people that would get together to go get something done. And in the Protestant space, you see the congregation, but you also see the faith based nonprofit, right? The abolitionist movement was an early expression of the faith based nonprofit. The Bible translation movement was an early expression of the faith based nonprofit. And now it has exploded. Is it wild, woolly, and chaotic? Absolutely. But it's also a beautiful picture of God's people who want to get things done.
Yeah, your point about churches partnering with a nonprofit that is for lack of a better term, secular. It's not rooted in faith or theology. Um, and of course, you wouldn't partner with a nonprofit that's like antithetical to what you stood for. But the idea, a lot of, for example, food relief ministries are just secular, but they're still doing a good work. And I to some extent, the infusion of volunteers who are faith based
Yes,
can help even transform the spirit of that organization, provided you may be serving for a different motive than other people are serving, but you're still there.
absolutely. And it's also important to realize that does the nonprofit need the congregation? Absolutely, right? By God's design. Oftentimes, the congregation is a conduit of resources to the nonprofit, financial resources, volunteer resources. But if you're a church leader, it's also important to note that by God's design, you and the congregation need the nonprofit. The nonprofit is a platform for you and your people to touch the community in a way that you may not otherwise have an opportunity to do so. So, again, by God's design, both structures, God's people in a congregational structure, God's people serving in a nonprofit, they're gifts to one another. But often what happens? The church, the congregation, looks at the nonprofit, the parachurch, maybe you're familiar with that term, the parachurch, as parasite. You just want our money and our people. And then sometimes the nonprofit leader looks at the congregation, whether the congregation is big or small, rich or poor. Hey, you're just a country club with a cross on it. You're more concerned about what happens within the four walls of your church than you are what happens out there. And I'm going and doing the work that you're supposed to do. Well, the reality is we're both assigned to work. We're both assigned to serve one another as the body of Christ. And when we don't, our community and our city and God's people lose out. So, healthier relationships between churches and ministries, I think, can encourage generosity. If a congregation wants to be more generous, they need good places where they can invest those dollars. So then the nonprofit needs to have a high and robust ecclesiology to say, hey, we're part of the Big C Church. We're not just here to take from the congregation, but we are here to be a platform for the congregation to reach their community. So a real attitude of mutual service to both can bless the community, equip the member, the congregant, to live out God's call in their lives, and increase generosity. Because too many of us have a theology of scarcity. There's only so much to go around, got to protect our turf. And generosity tears down the theology of scarcity.
So, Scott, you mentioned a bit of a checkered history often when churches and nonprofits try to work together. Some, as you mentioned, some churches won't partner at all. Others may, and again, good for them, show up once a year, but they're, for example,
Yeah,
like
it's shallow.
painting a room, right?
Yes, yes,
And then there are some churches that are eager to serve and they're all ready to go, and the nonprofit just drops the ball. So how can, if you're a pastor or a church or a nonprofit listening to this and you desire to have fruitful, enduring relationships, what are the
yes,
steps to take? And
yes,
and like, how do you choose a partner? You don't want to just
yes.
open a phone book and close your eyes and point, right?
Oh, Roy, I appreciate those questions. Well, I think it's such an important topic. I wrote an article on it, and we'll make sure that we get that article out to everyone. What does fruitful, I love your phrasing, enduring partnership look like, right? And so I think there are several principles. One is for both the pastor and the congregational leadership and the nonprofit leader to really look at each other through the lens of Scripture as co-laborers in the harvest together, and that we need each other. Okay, so Roy, here's what happens. I often hear pastors and nonprofit leaders agree on a common erroneous assumption. So I sometimes hear pastors say, you know, if the church were doing its job, we would not need the nonprofit. So in a sense, I guess they're a necessary evil, right? I sometimes hear nonprofits say, if the church were doing its job, I wouldn't have to do this. I have to do this because those people are not getting it done. They're both wrong. Both the congregation and the faith-based nonprofit are expressions of the Big C Church. We're on the same team. We have different functions. The congregation, right, pastors, by definition, we are a generalist organization. We got to do cradle to grave. Can a congregation, big or small, say, you know what? We're really good at funerals, but we're not good at weddings. So we're not going to do weddings anymore. We're going to just focus on our strengths. The congregation, in its beauty, by God's design, is an inefficient organization, cradle to grave, right? Now, God knows that. So out of the congregation come God's people who want to rally around a specific task. And mind you, congregations also have ministries. A congregation can have a food bank. A congregation can have a literacy program. Absolutely. But often these nonprofits emerge, right? Not to be a substitute for the church, but birthed out of God's people with a heart and a passion. So we've got to see each other as allies, as family, two sides of the same coin. And so we don't use each other, though it happens. Instead of using each other, we serve one another. And I think finding a nonprofit that has a high value on the local church, not just what we can get from the local church, but how do we serve the local church? And then for a congregation to see the nonprofit not just as a project, but a discipleship and spiritual formation platform for our people. So I think the mindset is key. And then I believe God will identify, hey, here are some who would share those same convictions.
Do you have any, for example, for lack of a better term, uh, case studies of where you have seen a church go through a transformative experience by applying these principles of
Yes,
outward generosity?
yes. Well, let me tell you about Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. So they were started in 1955. And from day one, in their bylaws, and I've never heard of a church doing this before, but they've done it and they've stuck with this now for 70 years. In their bylaws, Roy, it simply says, for every dollar we spend on ourselves, we give a dollar away. So from day one, their missions budget is set at 50% every year. Now, again, that's an outlier, right? But that's an example of a church that has done it and they've stuck with it. Now, they never had to fix that, meaning it was kind of set from day one. So I'm sure that has some benefits, right? But I've also seen other churches that have said, wait a second, maybe we can't get to 50%, right? We'll never get to 50%, or maybe we can, but what can we do to start? So at our church, where I was for 18 years, the first year I got to the church, our mission offering goal was $75,000. And we didn't make it. We only had given 72 that year. But 4 years later, we got to $1 million mission offering. Was that a strategic plan? No, but we knew our people could give more. We knew that if we told compelling stories and we did it frequently, that growth was possible. We did not expect that much growth that quickly, but it happened. And I had more people say, I now give more to the budget because our church is stretching itself to give more away. Never underestimate that connection. Friends, I don't know if you ascribe to this or not, but back to Ephesians 4, where we say that we are all as leaders called to equip God's people for ministry. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with APEST, APEST, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. So the apostle, the missionary, taking the gospel where it's never been. The prophet, hey, something's wrong, it needs to be fixed. The evangelist, it's not just about those that are in the room, we got to go out and bring the gospel to others. The shepherd, protect and conserve. And the teacher, making sure God's people are living and thinking right. Okay, I would say in God's design, APEST, all five voices are needed at the leadership table of a church or a nonprofit. But over time, something has happened. Congregational leadership is dominated by the shepherd and the teacher. And what they have in common is they tend to protect and conserve. And we know the gospel is worth protecting and conserving. Absolutely. What happens, though, around the congregational decision-making table, the apes, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, they don't always fit super well with the shepherd and the teacher. So what do the apes do? The apes go start nonprofits. They plant churches. They're more of the entrepreneur. In God's design, we need all five. We need all five around the decision-making table. But when congregations do not have the ape voices represented, congregations risk becoming internally focused, and many of God's people, they want to support not only their church, they also want to support the work of God's people outside the church. Friends, do not see that as competition. See that as part of God's economy and kingdom economy. So, pastors, church leaders, I would also say, when it comes to generosity and growing generosity among your people, have those other voices at the table and do some sacrificial risk taking. It's completely counterintuitive, but don't you tell your people that giving is counterintuitive. The more you give away, the more God's going to bless you. You say that to your people. You sometimes wonder why they don't believe you. Well, maybe they don't believe us because we're not modeling it as a congregation. Increase your missions budget, and I bet you will see an increase in your members investing in the mission of their congregation.
And I have to say, you threw me off with those entertaining acronyms: a pest, a pest, and apes. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, that's one of those things that you laugh about when you're in a meeting when you're not supposed to laugh.
But
So
you're exactly right. It's a lot of funny. So we talk about the apes and the tss, right, the S's and the T's.
Scott, obviously, this is more than a matter of words and more than a matter of communicating. However, communication obviously is fundamental to the equation. So what you've done is stepped back and looked at, okay, what are we doing? How are we acting? And how can that inspire people to embrace their call to be generous givers? But obviously, communication is a part of it. And I wanted to see your assessment, and you've got a great vantage point for that, is in churches do and we can apply this to nonprofits as well. Do they not talk enough about giving? Do they talk too much about giving?
Oh, I would say, Roy, not enough. It's not talked about enough. And when it is talked about, it's not talked about correctly. And in fact, maybe when it is talked about a lot and it's not done right, that's something as well. So, as a missions pastor of a church, I was always campaigning for opportunity to tell stories and to say thank you. Now, we have to be careful. All of us are capable of what I would call sophisticated mediocrity. And if we're not careful, we can do a pretty good job of pretending that we're more generous as a congregation than we really are. So what I mean by that is if if we make a great video about the $1,000 we spent on backpacks for the community, and we use that to encourage people to give more to their church, but maybe the unspoken reality is that 99% of what people give us is going to be spent on internal operations. And we're only going to do the bare minimum for the community, but we're going to make it appear as if we're doing more. You got to be really careful about that. And people may not be able to articulate it, but there's a sense that people just sort of know whether or not is this just smoke and mirrors? And is our mission giving, is our congregational generosity, is it commiserate and is it proportional? Right? I'm exaggerating here. If a mega church with a $60 million budget parades themselves as generous because they give 10% away, I would say a $60 million church budget and they can only find 6 million to invest in the lost, the poor, and the suffering. I don't think that's right. And again, what's the magic number? I don't know, but I do not think that you need to spend $54 million a year on operations, right? From a missions perspective, I grew up as a missionary kid and it's like, whoa. And I think one of the reasons that many congregations are losing people is because they don't see congregations as being generous and sacrificial. Too much talk, not enough action. That's not always true, but I think that any congregation has to really ask some hard questions. How does the congregation perceive what we are investing in our community and in our world? By the way, Roy, I was talking to some friends at Barna, the research company. They did a survey of pastors about generosity and a survey of nonprofit leaders. Both have concerns, but generally speaking, nonprofit leaders were more optimistic about the future than congregational leaders. Now, I think part of that is, I think the new rising generation, the younger giver, is more interested in cause, less interested in buildings and overhead. From a purely practical matter, if congregations were to redirect and reframe what they saw as generosity and giving, I think radical generosity is a way to engage the younger generation in a significant way. And Roy, in the chat, I'm going to put some stats. In the last 40 years, the number of congregations in North America has gone from 400,000 to 350,000. So that number is declining. In that same 40-year time period, and it's a lot harder to get stats on faith-based nonprofits than it is on congregations. But in that same 40-year time period, look, the number of faith-based nonprofits has gone from approximately 10,000 to 150,000. Now, no one wins, in my view, unless both of those numbers are up and to the right. So by working more closely together, we are able to equip our people more effectively, and we're able to have a bigger impact in our community. So both the congregation and the nonprofits need to go higher and deeper together, and I believe generosity will flow. And by the way, just like not every church is healthy, not every nonprofit is healthy. Many people say, there's too many nonprofits. I understand what they're saying. What would you ever say there's too many churches? So, in some ways, nonprofits need to learn how to work better together, as do churches need to learn how to work better together. But, would you say in your city that you only need one restaurant, or that you only need one hospital, or you only need one school? God in his manifest and manifold wisdom, God's people are free. So it's chaotic and it's wild and it's woolly, but that's why we need to work better together. So it's like a symphony that can actually be playing different instruments, but playing from the same sheet of music, right? To make a beautiful sound. What we hear is a lot of cacophony, true, but God's design is that it be a symphony in sync with one another.
Scott, have you found, and if you don't have a direct example, that's okay, but that it's a desire of churches to impact their communities, to impact outside of their walls. And of course, by doing that, they can do that by partnering with nonprofits and other organizations. But have you seen that the community at large is moved or inspired by a church's commitment to serve the community when that happens and when that goes on in an enduring manner?
Yes, Roy, absolutely. Here is a real life example. In all of our roles, you win some and you lose some, right? So as the missions pastor, every time we had a building campaign, I would ask the same question. Could we tithe on the building campaign? We want our people to give above and beyond what they normally give in order to finance this needed building. So let's model it. Well, I was successful partially one time. And we had a particular building campaign, and I got 5%. I was going for 10, but I got 5. And the first 5% went to a missions partner to finish building out their building. And it was the first 5%. It wasn't, if we get what we need, then we'll give you 5%. It was the first 5%. And Roy, it was so exciting how people rallied around the entire campaign. And it worked. And everyone wins. And so it was modeling for our people. We want you to stretch and give toward the work of this congregation. And part of the work of this congregation is investing in partners beyond ourselves. And by connecting it together, we were able to tell the story of not only, hey, we need this building, but let's tell you about our friends over there and what our generosity is able to do for them. So it was a win-win. So that's a real life example. And I'm convinced, excuse me, that if churches around the country, when they have a building campaign, if they were to tie the first 10% to partners around the world or in their community, not only does that excite their people, it answers the pagan critique that churches are all talk, not enough action. And it also answers the critique of a growing number of Christians who, if anything, are more prone to give to a nonprofit than they are to their own church. I don't want that. I want people to give lavishly to their church, and I want churches to give lavishly to ministry arms all throughout the community. Everybody wins.
Scott, can you explain again? I understand the big picture concept, but how did the church you were serving with, so they were in a building campaign,
Yes.
and obviously funds went to the campaign, but then 5% went to another ministry. What did that look like, or how did that work
Yeah.
exactly? How was that presented to the congregation?
Right. Well, and so as the missions pastor, I knew that this campaign was getting ready to be launched. And so I went through the proper channels step by step. Hey, I have an idea. What do you think? And not just should we, but how would we do this? Here's the particular ministry. Here's the particular need. They were obviously very trusted. We were partnering with them already, so we had good lines of communication. And so it was a lot of back and forth. Could we? Should we? How would we? And we started that early enough so that when we announced the campaign from day one, we could say, as part of the campaign, here is how we are going to help our friends in South Africa. And this was a ministry in South Africa, another church that were doing some radically generous things in their own community. This was 20 years ago when the AIDS crisis was really rampant, and a little Baptist church they built a 22-bed hospice to care for the dying in their community. And so we said, hey, do we need this facility? Yes, we do. But you know what? Our friends in South Africa, look what they're doing. So it wasn't just a building for them. It was a building for the community, right? So our gift enabled this church to elevate their presence in their community. And we just went step by step, trusted partner, a competent partner with a good plan, good communication, and our people loved it. And Roy, to your point, I think it inspired additional giving by our people that, hey, the pastoral leaders want us to give above and beyond for this. And our church is giving above and beyond. So it's a great model and example for your people.
Well, Scott, we have gone through all of our official questions. What else would you like viewers to know about this topic?
You know, I do believe that generosity is key. It is needed. And I would just want to encourage my nonprofit as well as church friends that so often we as leaders, we have to be careful that we don't teach one thing and live another. If we know how to teach generosity, let's model it ourselves. And God is a generous God. And so we live in that generosity. And I think telling inspiring stories is so important. Any worship service, regardless of sermon topic, there is a missions moment in any and every worship service. And so, how do we incorporate in our gathered worship experience a reminder of the world out there? And you know, fear is not a good look for God's people. The antidote to fear is to lean into God's mission in the world. And Caroline asks the question, how would you see this working in a church of under 50 members? Oh, I've seen it working in big and small ways. Same principles, right? And maybe even more important in those smaller churches to find those good nonprofit partners who are able to use your gifts, use your people, and for the church to be seen as a launching pad into the community through these nonprofit partners. So their same principles apply regardless of size church. But we have to eschew the scarcity mentality that is panic, that is worried, that we've got to grab and we've got to hold on to everything we possibly can because there's not enough. That's not biblical. And that's not the prosperity gospel that says, hey, just pray and God will give you riches. No, God is a God of abundance. So we have some years and seasons where God is abundantly lavish, but also there's the biblical concept of provision. Manna, sometimes he gives us just what we need, just in time. So both abundance and provision are from God, but God calls us to be generous, whether we're in a season of abundance or provision. When there's excess and when there's just enough, we're always called to share. We want our people to live that way. Let's let our churches live that way too.
Yeah, Carolyn's question that reminded me of I'm now no longer at this church, but spent about 5 years at a church about the size that Carolyn described, probably 50 people if everyone came. And now this wasn't officially meet the criteria of what we're talking about here because we didn't have a designated partner, but we did have a single mom's car care, change the oil. And then we had the kids involved, washing
Yeah,
tires and this kind of stuff. And everyone had such a blast, and it was a very relational event. It stretched, I think, some of us, and then some people who weren't very so involved actually jumped in and got involved. Like
there
for
you go.
example, yeah, we originally were going to have some restrooms that were available, with kids and moms. That's you got to have that, and we got locked out of those at the last minute. So somebody through their work actually had a porta potty, which they brought by truck. I mean, it took some extra time and work to do that. So
And by the way, I would just say this, Roy,
yeah.
that if you are a church, no matter what size church you are, big or small, be the church in your community that loves and blesses the nonprofits. Just like pastoral ministry can be very lonely, nonprofit ministry can be very lonely. And so, one simple thing you could do, host a lunch once a quarter for nonprofits in your area. And all you want to do is say thank you. And you want to learn what they're doing, ask questions, let them meet with each other. So rarely do they ever get invited somewhere just to be loved on. And that is a way you as a church can increase your leverage and your influence in your community. It's an easy win and everyone benefits.
Scott, what are some
Yes.
some resources that you want to offer them?
If you have nonprofits that you work with that would benefit from our training, send them our way. Because if we can equip the nonprofit to be a better nonprofit, that's going to be a blessing to you, the congregation that is supporting them. We also provide training on how churches and nonprofits can work better together. And if you want more details about how to increase generosity among your members, reach out to us. But fair warning, right? As we do that, we're also going to challenge one another to become more generous as congregations ourselves.
And you also mentioned, Scott, in the introduction, just for anyone who might have missed that, some other ways that I know you said you lead with generosity, but there are other ways that you help organizations to
Yes.
strengthen themselves.
Governance, strategic planning, mainly for the nonprofit,
Okay.
but we are growing our portfolio of resources specifically for churches. So I invite you to reach out and let's talk.
Well, Scott, I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I do encourage you, what a great offer from Scott and Mission Increase to consult about these vital issues for churches and nonprofits. And at Ministry Pacific, we are also here to consult, ministrypacific.com. Consultations are always free, and insurance is challenging in these days and in this time. A lot of companies are starting to not renew churches, or prices are going up. And so we'd be happy to help consult. So, Scott, thank you again. And it's
My pleasure.
awesome to be introduced to your really unique and innovative work.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you all.
All right. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thanks so much.